We are greatly honored tonight to have Ben Cardin address the Council. He just retired as chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, one of the most important foreign affairs positions in the U.S. government. He has devoted his life to public service, 58 years total, starting in the Maryland legislature, where he served for 20 years. He was elected to the House of Representatives in 1987 and the U.S. Senate starting in 2007 until the start of this year. He's been a frequent visitor to the Council. By my count, today marks his 10th appearance. And that is really fantastic. You know, this is what enables councils like ours to actually perform the service we have to perform, which is putting people in touch with the best thinking in foreign affairs that there is. This year marks the 50th anniversary of the Helsinki Final Act. And this was an agreement, I think, in the, I'm trying to think, Nixon or was it Ford administration, maybe Ford, which paved the way for the end of communist rule in Europe, the peaceful end of communist rule in Europe, and the transformation of what were then called satellite states into democracies. And he served on the congressional arm that has dealt with the follow-up, the Helsinki Commission, for 27 years. Some of his highest achievements have been in the field of human rights, and it's not just exclusively human rights, but certainly of interest to us. And he was involved in drafting and the passage of legislation which allows the U.S. government to sanction human rights violators in other countries, the so-called Global Magnitsky Act. He did this by pursuing what he calls value-based foreign policy, and by reaching across the aisle and working closely with his Republican colleagues. So much happens in the world so much of what happens in the world depends on American leadership. The Global Magnitsky Act is an example. It's been copied by many other countries around the world. But the question is this kind of collaboration, cross-aisle collaboration, still possible in the current era where we have a foreign policy being made under the rubric of America First, where the emphasis is on transactions, that is trades, rather than on values. So, Senator Cardin, we would be grateful if you can help us navigate, or at least think through what is going to happen in this new era. If you can enlighten us, we will all be in your debt. Senator Cardin.
What a charge. The lightning was, boy, you're putting a lot of pressure on me. But look, I would not have predicted where we are right now, so it's difficult to see what's going to happen in the next 30 days when we look at what happened in the last 30 days. But Roy, thank you very much for the invitation to return. I didn't realize it's my 10th visit here. I look at this as group therapy for me from for the challenges I have in my public life, to be with people who really do try to get independent news sources to figure out what's going on, and we can have a great discussion. I thank you for acknowledging that my wife Myrna is with me tonight. That's been one of the nice advantages of no longer being in the United States Senate. I'm actually here rather than there. And if I was coming here tonight, I'd be rushing from a vote to get here and not have a chance to hook up with Myrna. So that's certainly one of the, I'm frequently asked, do I miss being in Washington? And the truth of the matter is, when I see what's happening there, I wouldn't mind an opportunity to get engaged in some of those discussions and fights, but I'm really glad I'm not there. So it works out very well. And thanks for acknowledging Chris Lynch, who's my chief of staff, who been with me for almost my entire 38-year career in Washington. He took 1 or 2 years off for some sanity, but other than that, he labored through the entire time. And Lindsay McGregor's here, who we had the benefit of her help. She's now outreach for Congressman Johnny Olszewski. So thank you all for being here. I appreciate it very much. Now, you have to understand, Roy sent me this invitation on January the 9th. I was very excited about it. And I made a lot of notes about the challenges we're going to have under the Trump administration and how we're going to deal with that in a very positive way. Well, I threw out every one of those notes that I made back then because obviously things are a lot different than any of us would have ever anticipated. And we recognize that we have some serious challenges. So I'm here. I could be in D.C. as they're debating the nominee for the FBI who's up for confirmation this week in the United States Senate. I'm very happy that I'm here. Or I could be voting on the budget resolution, which is, again, a partisan vote. So it really is good to be able to escape those types of challenges. But what is really, really disappointing is that those votes are going to come down basically along party line. And I find that extremely disappointing when I recognize that in many of these nominees, they'll get confirmed, but a majority of the members of the United States Senate don't really support those nominees, would like to vote against them. Mike Staga, who has represented us in the Arctic region, and I mentioned his name particularly because he went through a very tough confirmation process. Very tough. He was actually suggested to President Biden by Senator Murkowski and Senator Sullivan from Alaska as being the right person to represent us in the Arctic. But he made a major mistake. Now remember, he was an expert on the Arctic. And he made a major mistake, according to the Republicans, because he visited Russia, a major Arctic country. Nothing else but a visit to Russia caused the Republicans to go through extreme measures to prevent his confirmation. Am I missing something here with Gabbard? How do you see it? Just doesn't add up when you take a look at what's happening. So I'm going to share with you in our discussion tonight the challenges that our nation faces, what we should do in order to meet those challenges, and talk a little bit about what Donald Trump has done during the first 30 days. And now I'll end on a positive note as to what we all can do. A question that's asked to me frequently: how do we get engaged? The topic is the crisis Donald Trump must confront. The view from a former chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, at least really I thought that was the topic I had tonight. So I'll probably deviate a little bit from that. Yeah, I'm a senator. I can change whatever I want. I'm a former senator. So let me share with you the global challenges that we confront and what the United States needs to do about it and how Donald Trump has responded, and then end up with what we can do. Now, I want to shock you for one moment. I did not support Donald Trump. During the election, I felt, for many reasons, that he should not be elected president. I thought his morals and character were just not of a person who should be president of the United States. It goes back to Charlottesville. It goes to what he did in regards to 2 impeachment trials that I participated in as a United States senator, as a juror, and to his criminal convictions, and the list goes on and on and on. So I was very concerned during the campaign, and I expressed those concerns. Some people thought I was exaggerating. At days, I thought I was exaggerating the damage he could do. I look at the first 30 days, and I underestimated the risk factors. So I want him to succeed in advancing our best interest, but I have several concerns that I'm going to talk about tonight. First, there needs to be a recognition that America's strength is in its values. We are the leader of the free world. Our values include support for democracies, good governance, anti-corruption, human rights. We believe diversity is a strength. Why? Because it allows us to include the talent of all people so that our nation can grow and all of us can benefit. And we have a responsibility as Americans, as the leader of the free world, what I call global citizenship. We have a responsibility to help lead the world to be a safer, fairer, and more prosperous world. Now, these global challenges that we confront today are real. It predates Donald Trump becoming president. Many of these have been trends over a long period of time. One is the fact that more people today are living in countries that are not democratic than in the last several decades. The Freedom House report comes out every year on the status of democracies. And this is the 18th consecutive year of the decline of democratic states. The report points out that there have been 52 countries where people are less free today than they were a year ago, where only 23 countries improved their rights under democratic values. And when we take a look, we see some of our NATO allies, countries that we are committed to defend through the use of our military, that you could not call democratic states today. Turkey's not a democratic state. Hungary's not a democratic state. And then you look at countries that we thought were moving in the right path, Georgia, taking a major step backwards. And then we look in our own country, our own hemisphere, where we've had a growth of opportunities from participations about people demanding their government be representative. The people of Venezuela spoke very clearly in their election, and yet their results were not accepted. So we have a decline of democracies that the United States, the leader of the free world, the leader for democratic states, needs to confront. And then you have the informal alliance that has developed. And it's getting more and more formal every day between Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. These are countries that all support transactional foreign policy as compared to democratic states that believe that our foreign policies must be embedded in our values. Transactional foreign policy believes that it's all right to use force, and it's certainly fueled by corruption. Take a look at Russia today. Mr. Putin, civil servant his entire lifetime, is purported to be one of the wealthiest people in the world. He uses those corrupt resources in order to get his way. And when he can't buy his way, he uses force. And that's exactly what he did in Ukraine. So we need to recognize that we have a responsibility to counter that. So in Ukraine, we came to Ukraine's help, as the free world did. Why? Because we recognized that Ukraine was the front line on the defense of democratic states. If Ukraine were to fall, there is a strong likelihood that Moldova and Georgia, that already have Russian troops in their territories, would fall next. But there was a real concern as to whether the Baltic countries would survive, because Russia has claim to the Baltic countries as being part of the greater Russia. And quite frankly, Poland felt the same threats. And it was unclear to Mr. Putin whether the NATO alliance would really stand up against him if he could take over Ukraine. So Ukraine is the front line, and one that we must provide the help that is needed. So what we find is that this war has been going on for way too long. I've talked to President Zelensky several times. I was in Munich last year for the security conference. I had a chance to meet with Mr. Zelensky last year. And I know that he is a shrewd negotiator. I know that he recognizes that he has to cut a deal at some point with Russia. His bottom line is pretty simple. Make sure I have secure boundaries, and make sure I have the support of a NATO alliance or a similar alliance so that Russia won't try to take over my territory again. So we've been working to give the Ukrainians the upper hand in negotiations so that it's clear to the global community that force did not win. What does Donald Trump do? Donald Trump comes into office telling Mr. Putin he wants to end the war at whatever is necessary. And then he says that Ukraine started the war. Now that's disinformation. The president knows that who started this war. It's common knowledge. I mean, this is not a state secret. We know whose tanks came into Ukraine. We know the immediate damage that was done. We know the losses that were incurred. We know that Ukraine has just tried to defend its territory, seeks no imperialistic interest beyond its original borders. And yet, the president says that Ukraine started the war. Now he's negotiating solely between Russia and Ukraine. Solely between Russia and the United States on Ukraine's future. What a negotiating position that is. Ukraine recognizes that it's at risk, and Europe recognizes that Ukraine's at risk. At the Munich Security Conference, there was discussion among our European allies as to whether they should establish a European security force, recognizing that America may not be there to defend them. It may not be there to defend Ukraine. If we're going to counter the relationship between Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran, we need to strengthen, not weaken, the transatlantic security partnership in NATO. That's got to be a key part of it. And yet, what Mr. Trump is doing is just the opposite. So we have a serious challenge as to whether America can be trusted by our allies, by our European allies. China is a major risk to us today. They're watching Ukraine. They're watching it very closely. They're making judgments today through their transactional foreign policy whether they can use force to take back Taiwan. That judgment will very much be influenced by what happens in Ukraine, whether the global community allows Mr. Putin to seize territory by force. Ukraine's actions also will impact not just Taiwan, but the China Seas. China is prepared to use force to control the China Seas against the interests of the international community and commerce, Japan, Vietnam, Philippines. All of their rights are being challenged by China, and China is prepared to use force. And if Russia succeeds in Ukraine, it's a model for China to succeed with the help of North Korea, which is helping Russia, Iran, which is willing to get involved, and Russia to help China. There's a lot at stake. China's also doing economic warfare. The question is, what type of an economy do we want in the future? Do we want economies that are controlled under China, market-controlled economies, or do we want a market that's controlled by the values that we cherish in our economic relations? We need to strengthen our economic tools, not weaken them. Now, there are a lot of reasons. I'm going to talk a little bit more about USAID in a moment. But that's one of our major ways of providing an economic alternative to China getting their grips on other countries by offering deals that are too good to be true, and they are too good to be true. But they use debt diplomacy in order to force their economic ways on other countries. We need a president who will stand up against that. And yet, it looks like President Trump's prepared to appease China. Now, you may say he's imposing tariffs, but he's imposing tariffs on our allies. China is applauding what's happening right now. A division of the West helps China with its economic game plan. They will have more influence rather than less on the global economy. So for all those reasons, President Trump is moving us in the wrong direction. So let me switch to the Middle East for one moment, because this is amazing. I've had the opportunity to meet with the leaders of 6 major countries in the Middle East. I've been there before and after October 7th, had a chance to meet with the leaders of UAE, of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Egypt, Qatar, and Israel. And they all have a common enemy. That enemy is Iran and its proxies. And they're all willing to come together to isolate Iran. The leader in this is the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, that's fully prepared to enter into a security pact with the United States that would protect the region against any attacks by Iran or its proxies against any of the players, including Israel, and to normalize its relationship with Israel. Now, Israel should have taken advantage of the first couple months of the combat against Hamas to find an off-ramp to be able to get this arrangement completed. It was set up to happen. Hamas did not want it to happen. We should have moved forward on that. But we need to keep that hope alive. And quite frankly, the only way it happens, and the only way you get peace in the Middle East, is with 2 states, a Palestinian state and an Israeli state, living side by side in peace. It's the only way it happens. But there's no conceivable possible way you can have normalization in the region unless that goal is attained. The Saudis cannot enter into normalization with Israel unless the Palestinians have a separate state. So when Donald Trump says that we're going to take over Gaza, you know, that's absurd. I mean, absolutely absurd. It'll never happen. But it's so damaging to our opportunities to be the player in the Middle East, to isolate Iran and its proxies and bring peace to that war-torn region. Donald Trump's moving in the wrong direction there. Asia Pacifics, and that's where the game is today. That's where we're spending most of our time and energy. We have really some great initiatives in the Asia Pacific area. The relationship that we developed between Japan and South Korea and the United States was historic, putting aside historic differences. The Quad is a critically important document that tries to bring together India, Australia, Japan, and the United States. Bilateral with Japan, bilateral with the Philippines. There's a lot going on in the Middle East for security. Donald Trump is now perceived as an unreliable partner. Will those agreements move forward? It's not even clear whether the August treaty will move forward that involves the modernization of our submarine force between UK, Australia, and the United States. So that's jeopardized because of Donald Trump's language and what he's doing. Again, these challenges have ways of moving forward to overcome. Donald Trump's moving in the wrong direction. I want to mention global leadership for the free world because to me this is extremely important. The United States is the leader of the free world. That leadership is desperately needed. We've talked a lot about on security and the economics front. We could talk about on protecting democratic institutions or anti-corruption or human rights or climate or health or poverty. All of those are areas where the United States needs to be the leader to bring the free world together for progress, for a more prosperous, peaceful world, which is in our national security interest. Our strength is in our commitment to democracy, human rights, good governance, global responsibility. Our credibility has been challenged by Donald Trump on these issues. It starts with what he's done at home, what he's done to our domestic support for democracies. He is weakening the checks and balances of our system of government, challenging the courts as maybe we don't have to follow what they say, impounding funds that Congress has appropriated, that he's required to carry out the acts of Congress. He says he's not. He's challenging whether he has to follow the democratic checks and balances of our system. because he's the president, and how can anyone challenge the president? But it goes well beyond that. What he's done in regards to the politicizing our civil servants, to me, is just horrible. People are getting hurt. I feel so sorry for those who are in public service who have really, there for the right reasons, because they believe in helping our country. And yet they're now being challenged if they don't really swear an allegiance not to our country, but to Donald Trump. The independence of our agencies are being challenged. We never intended that agencies should be under the thumb of either a partisan leader or an autocrat. That's not America. And yet you see what he's done in the Department of Justice. See what he's done with the inspector generals. The Kennedy Center, what he's done. Nothing's beyond his belief that we can't have independence. People can't think independently. They have to follow what he believes. That's not what a great democratic country does. One of my favorite issues to take up is anti-corruption. I'm proud that I've been associated with several bills that have been enacted to fight corruption. The most recent was that all of our embassies need to report on how well every country in the world is doing in fighting corruption. Joe Biden got it right when he says corruption is a core national security concern. Autocratic regimes depend upon corrupt funds. Every country has corruption, I understand that. But if your system is built on corruption, it's going to become an autocratic regime. So what does Donald Trump do? The Foreign Corruption Practices Act is the crown jewel in fighting corruption. It simply says that American businesses cannot give bribes to governments to get contracts. Pretty simple. Donald Trump has waived that law. It no longer applies. American businesses can now participate in corruption. The pardoning of Rod Blagojevich, the person with the golden ticket to become a United States Senator, pardoned. What he's doing today with the mayor of New York, Eric Adams, blocking a criminal investigation. America is not the image you want as a leader to fight corruption around the world. We have so many concerns about whether America will be a reliable partner and the leader of the free world. Does the leader of the free world tell our ally Denmark that we'll take Greenland even by force if we have to? Does he tell our southern neighbor that we're just going to change the name? We're not going to talk to you about it, of the Gulf of Mexico. Does he tell our northern neighbor that you're going to be our 51st state? How do you expect democratic states around the world to allow Donald Trump to be the leader to promote democracy and freedom? And U.S. soft power. I want to talk about this for a moment. I know we have the traffic relief services in the room. Sean's here. This is so offensive, but it's also dangerous. People are losing their lives. The president impounded all of our foreign assistance. Doesn't have the authority to do it, but he did it anyway. The money still hasn't been released. That means people are dying because they're not getting the help that they need. And so much disinformation is out there about this. Our foreign aid budget is a very small percentage of the federal budget. The total budget, if my numbers are right, are $68 billion we spent out of a $6.2 trillion federal budget. 1/3 of that, by the way, is in two countries, Ukraine and Israel, the largest amount in Ukraine. Our foreign aid budget is critically important for soft power. what General Mattis said, the former general and chair of the Secretary of Defense. If you don't give the State Department its budget on USAID and foreign assistance, you better give me 5 times that amount and more troops, because the world's going to be a much more dangerous place. A healthier, more prosperous world is more stable and less violent. It's not only the right thing to do from our values, that we respect humanity and we have a responsibility to help those that are less fortunate around the world. It's in our national security interest. And yet Donald Trump stops this. So we have our challenges. I need to mention one other area because no administration's talked enough about these issues. You may not even know where they are. Sudan. I remember not too long ago, Darfur was the battle cry, that we didn't want to see a genocide. Well, Darfur is happening in Sudan. And yet, very little attention is paid to that. Wasn't a lot paid during the Biden administration, and certainly none during the Trump administration. How about Haiti, our neighbor? It is on the verge, if it hasn't already been a failed state. We want to see stability in countries. We need to open our doors to those who are less fortunate to come here, but we want them to stay in their country and be safe. It's in our so much interest to reach out and help Haiti become a functioning country with safety. And yet no one's talking about that. We need to do a lot more. So let me just conclude by what our role is all about. I'm asked that frequently. That's why, Roy, I'm glad I'm here. I'm glad you're here. Because we all need to come together to figure out how we can help preserve our democratic institutions and freedom in our country and around the world. It starts by first countering disinformation. Disinformation is something that's grown in the last several years, where people say things they know are false in order to win their arguments. And when the President of the United States says that, millions of people believe him. And that starts conspiracy theories, and that starts people getting hurt. We need to recognize that we have a challenge as to how most Americans get their information. They're not getting it from independent investigative sources. We got to counter that. We got to figure out a way to do that. We got to teach history to our young people. They have to have an appreciation that we've seen this movie before. Recognize it. We got to explain civic engagement, how you can change the system in a constructive way. And we really need to teach civility. We need to listen to people who have different views. We got to build a broader consensus in this country. And quite frankly, I think we really do need to work to form bipartisan coalitions. Let me take you back to Trump 1. I worked with Bob Corker. I was ranking Democrat on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in those days. Bob Corker was the chairman, Republican from Tennessee. We worked and passed legislation, got it enacted in a bill the president had to sign that took away the president's authority to waive sanctions against Russia, because he knew he was going to do that. We worked together, Democrats and Republicans, large votes, in order to set up guardrails to protect policies that we knew were right for our country. Under the Obama administration, I worked with John McCain, a Republican from Arizona, to get the Magnitsky sanctions passed. The Obama administration opposed them. They didn't want Congress interfering with their reset with Russia. We said, you have all the reset you want, but it's got to be based upon values. We got that passed and enacted because Democrats and Republicans worked together. There's hope out there. I know the Munich Security Conference, my Republican colleagues met with Zelensky. I'm sure what he heard from my Republican Senate colleagues was a lot different than what's coming out of the White House today. We got to work together, Democrats and Republicans, to build the guardrails to make sure that we stay with Ukraine. We can do that. Marco Rubio cares a lot about human rights. I know that. I've worked with him on human rights legislation in China, against China. I know how he feels about human rights violations in our own hemisphere. We got to figure out a way to work with Republicans to advance those causes. We got to get building blocks to try to counter these actions. Nelson Mandela said, the only thing we can never give up hope, we can never give up, is our hope to bring about positive change. We all can do better. Dr. Martin Luther King charged each of us to do everything we can to make this world a better place. When we work together, we can bring about real change. Myrna and I will never forget the visits we went to communist Germany, East Germany, going through Checkpoint Charlie, talking to the East Berliners. We were their only hope that one day they could be free. We returned a couple years later, literally with hammer in hand, to knock down the Berlin Wall. We can bring about change. It can happen. My grandparents, escaping the pogroms of Europe, came here to the United States. Their grandsons served in the United States Senate. This is a great nation. Each of us has a responsibility to figure out how we can get effectively engaged to make our country and world a better, a more prosperous, a more peaceful place. Never give up hope. You can make a difference. And we're all going to find out, be really challenged during the next 3 years and 11 months as to how we can preserve this great nation. Thank you all very much.
Well, Senator, you certainly have given us some food for thought and some principles from your experience, and you have looked ahead in a way that is frightening, but real. And so we are very grateful to you for speaking here tonight and laying out the issues as you have. Now we'll take questions. I'll start off with one question, which is going back to the president and what he said about Ukraine, that Ukraine basically started the war, when everybody knows that that's just not true. That is totally the other way around. So what happens now? You've labeled this disinformation. What is the impact on American credibility around the world? Is there any way how long will it take to clean up the mess?
Well, thanks for an easy question to start it off. I think the global community recognizes that democratic countries do things that are sometimes difficult to carry out consistent policies. So the United States is not alone. Look what's happening in so many democratic countries around the world where nationalists are gaining more and more power. Germany, where the nationalist party is gaining more and more influence and could become part of the government. They're close enough to form a coalition. So, and Germany's been one of the strongest democratic countries since the end of World War II. So we see this happening in other countries. I think they understand that. They're more interested in what actions are going to take place. So on Ukraine, I know my Republican colleagues in the Senate. I know how they feel about Ukraine. They're not going to give up Ukraine. So I am certain there are discussions taking place on what they can do. Now, I urge my Democratic colleagues to be accommodating. Too often, the party that's in the minority is more interested in bomb throwing than getting things done. The stakes are too high in Ukraine. We got to figure out a way to work, Democrats and Republicans, to give Ukraine confidence that the support will remain, the funds will still be there, Europe confidence that we are not going to make these unilateral concessions to Russia, that the framework for peace is agreed to lines with guaranteed security. And I think if we work in those ways and those messages are I'm confident that in Munich, my Republican colleagues said something similar to what I just said. I've been with them before in similar circumstances where Donald Trump's name has come up. Now, will they vote on the floor of the Senate when the president is raw on his position? I don't know. That might be a bridge too far. Develop a strategy where it's hidden a little bit, but we still carry out our commitments to Ukraine. That's the strategies that we're going to have to follow. And at best, we're going to be damaged, but I think we can preserve our democracy.
I'm a PhD student just across town at University of Maryland Medical School, and I study a rodent model to understand opioid use disorder. And one of the things that I heard recently is that one of the lines Trump drew for the tariffs that he implemented against China is preventing the sale of ingredients to synthesize fentanyl in Mexico, which seems like it could potentially have good benefits for Baltimore. And I was wondering about your thoughts. Maybe he's doing things by accident, but some things might be helping country.
No. Fentanyl, which is a synthetic chemical, very deadly, confused with heroin, is killing Americans in great number. The source for most fentanyl is China, not all, but most is China. And it is a profit center for China. There have been many efforts made in negotiations with China to block the flow of fentanyl. Fentanyl is still not classified as at the same level that it needs to for a dangerous drug because it does have some positive values. So I agree with President Trump and I agree with President Biden that any supply of fentanyl that is aimed towards the United States, if it's not stopped, there will be penalties imposed against those that are providing that source. I think we had tremendous cooperation from Mexico on this issue because most of the drugs come in through Mexico. They may not originate in Mexico, but they come through Mexico into the United States. It's not easy to detect because it comes in trucks, it comes in goods other than it's hidden. It's not easy to find. Sometimes it comes in through drones. So it's not easy to interdict, but we should use every enforcement we can to block the illegal flow of drugs into this country. And fentanyl is one of the precursor drugs that have caused tremendous death in this country. So that one is going to have strong. So we actually put that in a bill. We put that in the bill that President Trump opposed and we weren't able to get passed. We had a bipartisan bill to strengthen our borders. That bill had those penalties on fentanyl in it. And it could have passed but for one person opposing it, Donald Trump.
I have a question about the relationship between the growing wealth inequality around the globe and its connection to growing autocracy. You're probably familiar with Anne Applebaum's Autocracy, Inc., and the way that the autocracies are supporting each other around the globe. What can we do? I guess it all comes back to that, right? What can we do? What should we be looking for? What sort of policies can be useful in pushing back against this growth of authoritarian governments?
The simple answer is stronger support for unions, but we have to figure out the modern economy is not the traditional employment relations. So we have to recognize that we need to be able to get collective bargaining strength to protect the workers in this country to get a better share of the wealth of America. So yes, I mean, it is a serious challenge. America, when I was in college, America, for a democratic state, had the least disparity between the wealthy and the poor. We're now the widest. So we've moved in the wrong direction. We haven't had enough profit sharing of the values of America, and it reflects the fact that unions have not been very effective in this country. And some of the policies that we've enacted, the 2017 tax bill, made it even worse. Now they're talking about extending the 2017 tax bill, which basically is a giveaway to large companies. So it's amazing that the attention is always on whether someone properly claimed the earned income tax credit, which I want to make sure there's no fraud in the earned income tax credit, which is a couple $100s for modest income people, but big corporations can get away with billions of dollars. We have about $1 trillion uncollected taxes every year. We try to do something about that with the IRA bill, and now they're going to repeal all the provisions of the IRA bill that relates to the IRS. So it's a very valid point. The frustrating part politically is that Democrats are taking as much of a hit politically for not solving this problem as Republicans. And it's causing the political climate to be not terribly favorable to correcting it.
My name is Pat Young. I'm a civilian employee of the Department of Defense, and I'm a retired commissioned officer from the Maryland Army National Guard. So I have a question about Israel. You'd mentioned a two-state solution for Palestinians and Jews in Israel. My question is, with the Palestinian population being so atomized and it being so difficult to physically move between settlements for Palestinians, in your mind, what geographically does a two-state solution look like for Jews and Arabs in Israel?
Right. I think the lines are fairly well understood among the Palestinians and the Israelis. There have been a lot of false starts, as you know, towards moving forward with a two-state solution. As recently as the middle of last year, but before the war, before October 7th, in the middle of that year, there were active discussions taking place between the Palestinians and the Saudis and also, by the way, the Jordanians as to where those lines would be. There was kind of an agreement also as to how the Palestinian Authority would be reconstituted to control this. I don't think the lines are as complicated as they seem. Settlements make it more difficult, no question about it. Settlements are not helpful. So there are going to be challenges. Politically, there's going to be some settlements that have to be dislocated. That's going to cause a major problem within Israel. But some of the lines, in order for them not to be so oblique, are going to have to be. You're going to have to deal with some of the settlement issues.
Like you mentioned earlier, Trump has made a lot of statements. My name is Lucas Blanton. I'm from one of the high schools that got invited to the
Great.
thing.
Thanks for being here.
So as you said, Trump has made many statements about taking land and sovereign nations that are not ours and it would be ridiculous to take them, I'll just say, in my opinion. And I feel like the reaction to that from the press and from people in the government has been weak in comparison to how I think if another president said that. So I feel like we're almost softening to that sort of idea. And how do you think that softening affects how the U.S. will carry out foreign policy?
It's a great question. It's really the key point that we haven't figured out yet. Because it's not that we're soft on this. I think we've been pretty loud about how ridiculous and how offensive it is. The Denmark embassy has been in contact with many of us. They were in contact with me. I'm not even in the Senate anymore to express their concerns about it. So I think we've had press conferences and things like that. That the challenge is that when President Trump goes before a camera, the whole world's listening to him. So he has the audience. So the day after he announced Greenland, he had the microphone on another issue. That issue was getting the attention. So our response was not getting anywhere near the penetration of his comments. So this is a continuing problem. President Trump's before the TV, before the press every day. And it is a challenge to figure out how you can focus And you can't get, look, when they tax foreign aid, there's a whole group of people get upset about that. When he attacks the environment, there's another group of people get upset about that. When he attacks the civil servants, there's another group that gets. How do we get everybody together to be able to focus on a response that we can make some penetration with the public on how absurd and how wrong that proposal is? We haven't figured that out yet.
Thanks.
So we've established that Trump uses a lot of autocratic language. You could even say that he's a threat to American democracy. So some of these questions are wondering, what can Democrats do to organize themselves? As a former Democratic senator, how would you advise the leadership in Democratic leadership in the Senate today on its public messaging in particular? Who even speaks for the Democratic Party? What does the opposition look like in the next 4 years? And someone brings up, is invoking the 25th Amendment at all an option?
The 25th Amendment, that would require the cabinet was just approved to take action? Is that what you're referring to?
I believe so, yes.
Yeah. That cabinet loves Donald Trump. I mean, no, the difficulty today is that Democrats have yet to acknowledge what went wrong in the last election. We have a hard time believing that so many people believe that we are elitist, representing the privileged and not the people who need government help. And there is a nationalist trend, which means our global responsibilities are not going to be as politically important as we would like to see them. So when you combine the fact that Democrats are global in their view as to what America needs to do, we're concerned about migrants, we're concerned about the environment, we're concerned about trade. But these are issues that really bother us, that we want to be good global citizens on. The populace that we're trying to get to vote for us doesn't care about. That's not their priority. And they look at us as being elitist because of the reasons that was the last question was asked. They see the wealth disparities. They see promises made that they were going to do well, and they see the grocery bills going up, see gasoline prices going up, and they're wondering what's happening, and they want to see a change. So we need a leader that will bring us together and focus us on the bread and butter issues that Americans are concerned about without compromising our values, but not yielding to every cause that is brought up that we care about. I care a lot about human rights issues. That is one of my top priorities. We can't lead with our human rights issues if we're going to try to be successful in outing Donald Trump's policies. So we have to figure out a way to do that so that we can promote human rights.
First of all, I'd like to thank you for your long career of public service. It's rare, and I'm grateful. And I also heard what you said about the Republican caucus. I am skeptical, but hopeful. You know them better than I do. I, for one, am shocked at the Europeans' response to Trump's election. I thought the day after he was elected that it was crystal clear that the fate of Ukraine was in their hands, that U.S. support would be withdrawn. I heard you when you said that you have some confidence that the Republican caucus will prevent that, but even if they succeed in preserving our support, I suspect the Trump administration would probably succeed in slow walking or hobbling it through intentional incompetence. So my question is, the day after the election, European leaders should have set their hair on fire and gotten ready for what happened this past week, where Trump unilaterally made concessions without getting anything from the Russians. Why do you think it is that they were so ill-prepared even 2.5 months down the road? And even given their domestic political situation, which is quite fractious, as you pointed out, do you think there's a chance that they'll be able to get it together in time?
Yeah. Europe looked at what happened during Trump 1 and said, it was terrible. We survived it, and we had our friends, and we were able to maintain NATO. During that period of time, there was a law passed that the president can't unilaterally withdraw from NATO. Yes, we had to pay more, but NATO's pretty strong today. Some of the things he did actually helped the transatlantic partnership when everything was said and done. So we know there was a fight on Ukraine, but at the end of the day, a divided Congress provided the money for Ukraine. And maybe it was done in a way, somewhat in a warped way, that it provides greater accountability. So I don't think they were prepared for everything Donald Trump's doing. I don't think any of us were. As I said, I thought I was exaggerating the problems this nation would face under a second term of Donald Trump. As it was, I underestimated the challenges. And then lastly, it's only been 30 days. Sometimes we forget that. It takes a little bit of time for this to sort of sink in. And a lot of our political systems of our allies take a little bit of time for them to get their act together. So I would not underestimate the challenge that Europe knows that they have to confront. I will tell you that there is different views among European capitals in European countries. So it's not a unified position. Ukraine's not a unified position among Europe. There's some European countries that don't want to provide any more help to Ukraine. So the further you get away from Ukraine, the less support there is for Ukraine. So it's not as simple as saying Europe needs to do certain things. Europe is the EU, but it's also UK and other countries. How do you put all that together? It's not as simple as it sounds.
And I have a statement to make. When I was coming here from Carroll County, I did not cross one trans person. When I went to the market and the eggs were $7, I complained, but I still got them. And I noticed that during this election, the hoopla was all about trans. It was about the price of eggs. And I haven't heard you mention, how do we pivot the country from Christian nationalism, which is just as bad as something, in my opinion, because I'm a bishop, I could say this, just as bad in the rhetoric as sometimes Hamas can be. Because a fascist is still a fascist, no matter what ocean divides it. So how do you stand against a Christian nationalist when they feel like it's their God telling them this? And how different is that if it's a Muslim person who feel like their God is telling them that? So how are we combating the same religious rhetoric in America that pivots? And my second question is, no offense, how do we get white people to stop voting against their own best interests? No offense, because we all knew where Donald Trump was, and you only had two choices, this or that. And we have to deal with what you said in a roundabout way. I'm more naked with it. We have to deal with a hatred issue, because if your hatred still makes you vote for something that's not viable, not even for yourself, it's almost like saying, I'd rather burn the house down and be king over ashes than to share resources. And hopefully we can put more dollars in education and history, because we can't run from it. You have to give some prudence that we never corrected the past. And so we keep ending up at this space where I need exactly what you need: good health care, good education, and good neighbors, whomever they may be. And if I ask this question rhetorically, how many of you, and no offense to the trans community, how many of you came across a trans person? So in actuality, if you're coming across them less than 2% in your life, then what is the deeper meaning and issue? So I said all that mumu jambaba for you to help me out.
Sure.
With America.
First, it was one of my elections that I was pretty confident I was going to win a re-election to the House of Representatives. So I was on a crusade to get 100% of the vote. It didn't go very well. There are people, whatever I tell them, are not going to vote for me. It's not going to happen. I can try to sugarcoat it any other way. They're not going to vote for him. There are people out there I don't expect will ever vote the way I would like, the person I would like to see them vote for. We got to recognize that and not over-respond to that threat. The second point is, can a moderate ever win president? I don't know. I'm not sure today, because a moderate's going to be attacked by either the right if it's a Republican or the left if the person's a Democrat, and may not be able to get the type of support necessary either to be nominated or elected. And we saw that happen a little bit in this election, because President Biden, who I think was one of the most progressive presidents we've ever had, his policies that he enacted during his first 2 years were incredible, and his implementation of so many different policies were very progressive, was seen by our far left as not being left enough. And when Kamala Harris became our nominee, she lost some support from the far left. So I don't know whether a moderate can win today. I just don't know. I hope that's not the case, because I happen to believe that we're better off at times listening to both sides and trying to come to a broader consensus in this country. Last point. We need to concentrate on eggs, not trans. I strongly support the trans community and will fight any form of discrimination against the trans community, because that's the right policy. But the politics of trying to win an election, that's not where you want to be. You want to be with the eggs crisis. And we got distracted. Certainly on the trans issue, we were distracted in the election. It clearly played a role. Whether it was the role or not, we can argue that. We'll never know for sure. But I also know gay in the military became a major political issue at one time in our politics. It was the wrong issue that we wanted to talk about. We can't let our opponents control the areas of the debate. And we tend to fall into traps too easily. And that's one of the things we have to correct. But the price of eggs is clearly was a dominant issue in this campaign.
Do you expect any, as a person who's specified that values are what really matters, who's done so much in the human rights area, do you expect any progress in human rights in the next 4 years?
No.
And in fact, bridging off from that, is there a possibility that the United States will quit the United Nations? And what happens then? Who takes our place? Please repeat the question.
Yeah. They're easy questions. Are we going to leave the United Nations? And will human rights agenda be advanced during the Trump years? On leaving the United Nations, I don't believe that will be part of the. What we do is we cripple these organizations. We don't leave them. We don't pay our dues. We don't participate in the areas that we don't like what they do. And then we prevent any participation or from the United States on arms of the United Nations that we disagree with their policies. But we won't leave the United Nations. I don't think we'll give up that right. We have too much of a say. We have the veto in the Security Council. I don't think we want to give that up. So I think we stay where we are in the United Nations. I don't think that's at risk. But will we allow the United Nations to do its positive work? That requires a lot more attention than we've given them in the past. We haven't been a great participant in the last 20 years in the United Nations. We could have been stronger. And there's a lot of things the United Nations does that I disagree with. But it is the international organization, and it has to be respected. On the human rights front, I think we can make progress during this. It won't come from Donald Trump. Donald Trump's transactional. He's going to be more concerned about his priorities, and they don't include human rights. Only if it becomes very visible and personal, like American detained overseas, he'll be concerned about that. And that's an important issue, don't get me wrong. But he's not going to be dealing with the on-ground problems that people face in Sudan or hunger or dealing with the global health issues that we have and pandemics or things like that, that's not going to be of his concern. But there are members of Congress that are very much engaged on this issue. And I think they're going to speak out. I think you're going to see appropriators and authorizers that are going to be actively engaged in advancing human rights. The popular political venues are China, where there's a lot of interest among Republicans in advancing human rights in China, as well as Democrats. So yes, I think there's a way that we can advance human rights during the next 4 years, but don't look to Donald Trump to be but in fairness to Donald Trump here, I haven't found too many presidents that have really gone out of the way to advance human rights. It usually comes from Congress.
Senator, I've got to thank you on behalf of our board and on behalf of our members and our guests today for speaking. I thought it was an outstanding presentation that was gave a wide sweep and gave us the bad news, the good news, and the ugly news, but gave us the facts.
Well, the proof is, do I get invited back for an 11th appearance? We'll see. Thank you all very much.
The answer is yes.